I have a confession to make, which is that normally I teach undergraduates, and most of them were born during the Clinton administration. So it gives me particular joy to speak to a room where I am not the only one who lived during the Cold War. So I really want to welcome you back to campus, and you're welcome to come to my class winter quarter as well. Before I jump in, let me just say what an exciting time it is to be researching and teaching in international security here at Stanford. We are more interdisciplinary than we have ever been before. So one of the hats I wear as an administrator is co-directing the Center for International Security and Cooperation, which is just upstairs. And we are now moving into cybersecurity, bringing together faculty from computer science, from law, from political science, from history, to look at challenges in cybersecurity. The international security world is changing in some profound ways, and Stanford has been very innovative and adaptive, something that the intelligence community needs to learn a lesson from, in thinking about how to cross traditional boundaries to get some insight about how to think about these challenges and how to respond to these challenges. So my partner in crime, the science co-director at the Center for International Security, is a doctor named David Relman. He's an infectious diseases specialist. And so he has taught me that I am not an individual, but a host organism for a whole colony of things. And that I should be very, very afraid of things that I can't even see. So I'm happy to talk about some of the things that we're doing on the research side, on the teaching side, and on the policy side here at Stanford. But if you're an international security junkie like me, you should come back again as a Stanford undergraduate because it's a very exciting time. Now, I know you all didn't want to hear a lot about administration. You're here to learn about spies. Spies in TV, spies in the movies, and how realistic they are and how influential they are. So let me start by sharing with all of you a tale of two headquarters. Now, I know they call it classes without quizzes, but they lied. I'm going to ask just one quick quiz. Has anyone been to CIA headquarters before? Raise your hand if you've been. A handful of people. Okay. So for those of you who raise your hands, you know that the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia looks nothing like you'd think it would from the movies. There are no fancy retina scans or fingerprint devices, not even the iPhone 5s that have just come out where you put your fingerprint in to get the security code. It looks more like a post office. It has sort of a shabby 1970s bureaucratic building feel to it. So that's CIA headquarters. Now let me tell you about another center, another headquarters. It's called the National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC. Now, NCTC was stood up shortly after 9/11. It's a relatively new intelligence agency designed to fuse terrorism threat reporting across different agencies of government. Now, NCTC does look like it came straight out of Hollywood. It does have the fancy screens and zinging graphics, and it does have that operations center feel that looks like it could come right out of 24 and Jack Bauer's CTU. And the reason it looks like it came straight out of Hollywood is that it did. The US government, you can't make this stuff up, the US government hired a team of Disney engineers to create the National Counterterrorism Center's operational headquarters to make it look like it should from the movies. And so this raises the question, is this art imitating life or is this life imitating art? Now, most people know deep down, that's a true story, right? Most people know deep down that real spying is different than what they see in entertainment. And I always put this slide up for my students, and they get the point right away. As one intelligence official put it to me. As one former senior intelligence official put it to me, most of us, you like that, most of us, he said, aren't as good looking as how we're portrayed in the movies. And none of us actually solve problems in 42 minutes or less. But the real question is, how different is real life from the movies, and why does it matter anyway? And that's what I want to talk about here today. So let me take a step back for a minute and talk about how much more important intelligence is in the current threat environment than it was during the Cold War. Now, this is a picture of Nikita Khrushchev banging his shoe at the United Nations Security Council, a sort of iconic image of the Cold War. During the Cold War, our biggest adversary, the Soviet Union, was easy to find and hard to kill, right? So the Soviet Union had territory on a map, they wore uniforms, they had embassies, they had offices. We knew who they were, we knew where they were, we knew they had nuclear weapons pointed at American cities. And so the first and last line of defense for American national security during the Cold War was firepower. Could we credibly threaten massive retaliation against the Soviets to prevent a nuclear war from ever starting? Today, it's the opposite. Today, our terrorist adversaries are hard to find and easy to kill, whether by human special forces or whether by lethal drones. So in today's international security threat environment, the first and last line of defense is no longer sheer military firepower, it's intelligence. The counterterrorism game is an intelligence game. In addition to that, we have a much more fluid threat environment than I would argue we've had in most of American history. Even after the end of the Cold War and that decade during the 90s, the threat environment wasn't nearly as dynamic, not nearly as fluid as it is today. Just to give you some sense of this, every year the Director of National Intelligence gives a public threat assessment to Congress, where he actually lays out what the threats are facing the United States. In the past 5 years alone, the Director of National Intelligence has listed 3 different number 1 threats facing Americans: the global economic crisis, cybersecurity, and terrorism, a much more fluid threat environment. And when the threat environment is more fluid, intelligence becomes more important, because the role of intelligence is to reduce as much as we can uncertainty so that policymakers can make better decisions. And then finally, there are some sort of basics of the threat environment that are still wildly unclear. How many adversaries do we have today? What does it mean, Al-Qaeda and associated forces? Who are our adversaries? Is China a rising ally or a rising rival, for example? And what's the magnitude of threats that we face? How worried should we be about a critical infrastructure attack through cyber means? How worried should we be about pandemics, whether they be natural or man-made? Every day we're told to be afraid of something very different. And so in a world where the number and the identity and the magnitude of dangers that confront our national security are all more unclear, intelligence matters more. Right? So for all these reasons, I would argue intelligence is far more important today than it's even been historically, and yet most of us know very little about how this world actually works. Last time I checked, it could have gone up to a couple more, but the last time I checked, a couple years ago, only 2 members of Congress, 2 out of 535, had ever worked in an intelligence agency before. Now, if you compare that to members of the Armed Services Committees, typically about 1/3 of them have had prior military experience. So members of Congress that are critical in passing legislation about intelligence come with almost no prior experience from personal experience in the intelligence business. Universities are not educating policymakers and citizens of tomorrow either about intelligence topics. I looked at the top 25 universities ranked by US News and World Report in 2012. And I looked at their course catalogs to see how many of them taught courses on intelligence. And what I found was that only a handful did. Stanford is one of them. Twice as many universities in the top 25 offered courses about the history of rock and roll, which I tell my students means they have a better chance of learning about U2 the rock band than U2 the spy plane. Now, since 9/11, political scientists, and I'm a card-carrying political scientist, I have written about 2,000 articles in top academic journals on a host of topics. Of the 2,000 articles, only 3 have touched on intelligence topics since 9/11. So while policymakers have been grappling with NSA surveillance, targeted killing, interrogation techniques, most political science professors have been busy researching just about everything else. Now, in part, this lack of research has had to do with secrecy, right? The National Security Agency for years stood for no such agency, NSA. And I can talk a little bit about that. I was invited just a couple weeks ago, along with a handful of others, to actually go to the NSA. And I joke that when they call in the social scientists, you know they've really hit rock bottom. And so they're trying to figure out how to actually let outsiders in part to be able to educate others about what it is that they do. But the upshot of all of this is that when it comes to intelligence, facts are in short supply, but fiction is not. So let me give you an idea of what's happening with spytainment. In the past 15 or 20 years, the spy-themed entertainment industry has skyrocketed. Let me give you just a few examples. Books. Ludlum and Clancy together have sold more than 300 million books. That's about one for every American. Video games. In 2009, half of all adults and 97% of all teens played video games. And spy-themed games were top sellers among them, catapulting the industry from a $2 billion business in 1996 to a $16 billion industry just a couple years ago. TV. I looked at the Nielsen's top 100 ratings from the 1990s through the 2000s and found a 600% increase in the number of spy-themed television shows that made the Nielsen's top-rated shows from the 1990s to the current decade. And then, of course, there are movies. Since the year 2000, spy-themed movies had made the list of the top 10 grossing US films by box office sales every year since 2000. Today, the relationship between Hollywood and Washington is cozier than ever. The CIA actually does, can't make this up, pitch storylines on its website. The Pentagon has forward deployed to Los Angeles, where it has set up entertainment liaison offices there to work with Hollywood better to make movies. Catherine Bigelow and Mark Bowl, the director and the writer behind the movie Zero Dark 30, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, had better access to the operational details of the Osama bin Laden raid than most members of Congress or most intelligence officials. Now, don't get me wrong, I am married to someone who was a Hollywood screenwriter for many, many years. And I love getting transported to imaginary worlds where Congress actually works. and where spies all look like Daniel Craig, right? Who can argue with that? But my research has found that the blurring of fact and fiction has real policy consequences, and policy consequences that we haven't even fully grasped yet. And that's what I want to talk about. Tom Clancy once said, and I love this quote, "The difference between fact and fiction is that fiction has to make sense." The real world of intelligence is far more cloistered and far more complicated than what we see in the world of fiction. And so let me dig in a little bit to what I mean by that. I did a poll last year that started to get at questions about what do Americans know about intelligence? What are their opinions about critical issues like interrogation? And what are their entertainment viewing habits? It turns out no one had asked these questions before. So we fielded at Stanford a national poll through YouGov and The Economist and did it last year, and I just got the same poll or similar poll back this week. So I'm going to share with you some of the numbers that we've been crunching that have not been public yet about the NSA. So that's my teaser for later. But let me start with baseline information, because I think it shows something that a nonpartisan intelligence science board concluded a few years ago, which is that entertainment has become adult education, and that most Americans actually don't know very much about how intelligence operates. Let me share, this is the question number 1. And because it's classes really without quizzes, I've given you the answer, so I won't ask you the answer. So the question is, about what % of information in a typical intelligence report comes from secrets? Now the answer behind me you'll see in bold, it's less than 25%. Most information, and in fact the real answer is about 10%. So 90% of information in a typical intelligence report is from unclassified or open information that is put together with that document stolen from the Prime Minister's safe or that email that the NSA has intercepted. And it's the marriage of the secrets and the open source information that makes intelligence products so valuable. But this question, as you see at the bottom, if you ask it, it turns out that 93% of Americans, and it's a national representative sample of 1,000 people with a margin of error plus or minus 4 points, 93% either didn't know or got the answer wrong. This is a pretty basic understanding of the fact that intelligence agencies really aren't dealing very much with secrets, right? It's a part of what they do, but not a huge part of what they do. Here's a question I asked about the National Security Agency. What activities does the NSA do? Now, more people know the answer to this question this year than they did last year. So you'll see at the top, the answers are build spy satellites. That's not true. The NSA doesn't do that. But about 1/3 of all Americans think that it does. The NSA does not interrogate detainees, but 1/3 of all Americans think that it does. It does not conduct operations to kill or capture foreign terrorists. 28% of Americans last year thought that it did. It does, in fact, always has been a code-breaking agency. That was its raison d'etre when it was created in the 50s. It breaks codes and it makes codes that keep, say, our nuclear weapons safe, right? So the secured systems that guard our nuclear arsenal, NSA comes up with. Okay? It does, we now know much more than we did before, intercept phone and email communications. And I can talk about that more. And it does, in fact, analyze information. So I asked this same question this year, and let me just share with you a couple of the numbers that'll give you an idea of just how much we don't know as Americans about what the agency does. In terms of interrogating detainees, this year we asked if you didn't know at all. Before it was, did you believe yes or no? And now we ask yes, no, or don't know. Interrogating detainees, 77% of Americans either didn't know whether the NSA interrogated people or got it wrong. Right? 3/4 of Americans. Similar numbers for the other ones on this chart that were not true. 3/4 of Americans actually don't know or get the answer wrong with the National Security Agency. So let me ask one that you can now use when you go to reunion parties and show what you learned from your class without a quiz today, which is about how many agencies are there in the U.S. federal government involved in collecting or analyzing intelligence. Are there fewer than 4? Are there single digits? Is it around a dozen, or is it 15 to 20? The correct answer is 17 at the bottom, right? Probably a lot more than you might have imagined, right? Now, before 9/11, there were 12, and that number has gone up. There are a lot of agencies. Why do we care about this? This is not just a professor being professory, saying you don't know what we study in the academy. This simple fact about the number of intelligence agencies is really important because it suggests why coordination of intelligence was so bad before 9/11 and why intelligence reforms have still had trouble even after the deaths of 3,000 Americans on September 11th. It shines a light on just how important it is to think about interagency coordination in intelligence reform today. In my review of intelligence adaptation failures before 9/11, one of my conclusions is that coordination across agencies was a critical failing because there were so many agencies to coordinate. And if you buy the argument that coordination is a critical problem, creating more agencies after 9/11 to coordinate is probably not a move in the right direction. So the number of agencies matters for that kind of baseline understanding about what are the requirements for intelligence reform and how should we be thinking about that. Let me get back to my 2012 poll and give you some more interesting findings. So I asked about baseline understanding, and then I asked about people's attitudes towards torture, the hot button issue from last year. And I asked the question in the same way it was asked in 2007. Would you be willing or not willing to have the US government torture known terrorists if they know details about future terrorist attacks in the US? Now this question is loaded, right? They're known terrorists. They know about future terrorist attacks in the US, right? But look at the comparison over time. In 2007, the poll said 27% said they were willing to torture somebody under those conditions. In 2012, the percentage of those who said they were willing to use torture jumped to 41%. That's a gain of 14 points. At the same time, you see a decline of people who are unwilling to use torture. So when the question was asked of Americans in 2007, more than half of all Americans said they would not be willing to use torture under those circumstances. Same question asked in 2012, that had dropped to only about a third of all Americans, right? So a decline of 19 points. Americans, my polls find, don't just like the general idea of torture more now, they like specific torture techniques more now too. So I asked specific questions about specific techniques. And the best poll I could find during the Bush administration was in 2005, and it was fielded by USA Today, CNN, and Gallup, and they asked these questions about specific techniques. And so I used the exact same wording, right, because that's important when you're doing polling. Let me just run through the techniques briefly. You are a very brave crowd, I have to say, to come for your classes without quizzes to hear about waterboarding. So the first technique is waterboarding, which, as you probably know, is simulated drowning, where you strap someone to a board and you pour water through their mouth till the person feels as though they are really drowning. And it's supposed to be absolutely terrifying. The second technique is what's called stress positions. It's forcing prisoners to stay chained and naked in uncomfortable positions for several hours at a time. The third technique is rendition, or threatening to send someone to a third country like Egypt, where they're known more to engage in torture. Religious humiliation, there are some specifics with that question I'm happy to go into. Threatening a prisoner with dogs, and prolonged sleep deprivation. Now, there are a couple of really interesting things about all these numbers on the slide that you don't need to wallow in, but let me just highlight. You'll see that on the left-hand side, support for every technique from 2005 to 2012 went up, except for sleep deprivation. I don't know why, with sleep deprivation. So in the case of waterboarding, we have a jump of 9 points. That's well outside the margin of error. We have double-digit increases in support for naked chaining stress positions and rendition. The other really interesting thing about this chart is the other side. This side. Look at the dramatic decline in the number of people who say it's wrong, right? So waterboarding is wrong. 82% said waterboarding is wrong in 2005. 55% said it was wrong in 2012. Big double-digit declines in the percentage of Americans who think these specific techniques are wrong. So at the same time that we ended a lot of these practices from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, you see increasing public support for these techniques. And by the way, my latest poll just this week, I asked the question of general torture. The numbers have gone up still more. Support is rising, okay? So why do we see this? How can we explain why support is rising? There are a number of possible explanations. It could be that 2005 was a low point in sort of support for torture techniques. It was right after the Abu Ghraib scandal. It could be that people really hit their most anti-torture stance in 2005. And what we're really seeing now is the equilibrium point. That's one explanation. But I do think that the data suggest that media effects, the effects of spytainment, are a strong contender. Americans who said they frequently watch spy-themed TV shows or movies are significantly more likely than infrequent watchers, according to my polling, to approve of all of these techniques on this chart, except for threatening detainees with dogs. Again, some things you just don't know. So let me give you some examples. These are statistically significant results, and you can see the gap. I separated respondents into frequent spytainment watchers. Again, this is TV and movies, and infrequent watchers. And in some cases, I broke out the TV viewers from the movie viewers. Willing to assassinate terrorists, a 14-point gap between the frequent watchers of spytainment and the infrequent watchers of spytainment. Waterboarding is right, an 18-point gap. 38% of spytainment heavy watchers think waterboarding is right. 20% of infrequent watchers think that it's right. Rendition, this is transferring prisoners to a third country where they may engage in torture. Frequent TV spytainment watchers, 60% of them say that it's right, compared to 45% of infrequent watchers. A similar trend with moviegoers. Even naked chaining and stress positions. Frequent spy moviegoers favor that more than infrequent moviegoers. Again, all highly statistically significant findings. Now, as I often tell my students, correlation is not causation. These things are correlated, but it doesn't mean that television is necessarily causing these attitudes. It could be that people who like to watch Homeland or 24 are naturally more hawkish than the average Joe, and so there's no causal relationship between what they watch and what they think. Maybe they think the attitudes first and are drawn to this spy-themed entertainment as a result. That's possible, but I have my doubts. Entertainment, we know, has shifted popular culture on a number of other attitudes. Remember LA Law in the 1980s? Law school applications as a result of that hit TV show went through the roof in the 1980s. The Navy still talks about Top Gun as one of its best recruiting tools. And prosecutors have been bemoaning the CSI effect and saying that how the popular TV show has led jurors to expect fancy forensic evidence. And so prosecutors have to actually address that problem and explain why they don't have fancy forensic evidence in making their case in court. Before 9/11, research has found that torture was almost always depicted in TV and in the movies as something that the bad guys did. And after 9/11, that trend reversed. The Bush administration policies may be over, but their policies are more popular today than they have ever been. So that's, on the one hand, spytainment, I think there's evidence that it could be influencing public opinion, sort of mass attitudes. There's also some evidence that it's directly influencing policymakers as well. It's funny, I was just talking with a former intelligence official this morning. I was saying how I was going to be giving this talk, and I said, what do you think about spy-themed entertainment? And he said, well, policymakers watch the same shows that the rest of Americans watch. And so it affects what they think too. It absolutely does. But let me give you some at least anecdotal examples to make the point. In the fall of 2002, when interrogation techniques were first being discussed and brainstormed, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Diane Beaver, who was the staff judge advocate general at Guantanamo Bay, where many of the detainees were being held, ran a series of brainstorming sessions about interrogation techniques. Jack Bauer, she later admitted, gave people lots of ideas. She later approved the use of dogs, sexual humiliation, waterboarding, and other controversial techniques. The dean of West Point, General Patrick Finnegan, was so concerned about the influence of the TV show 24 on his cadets and how it encouraged them to use torture and other techniques that violated their training and their rules, that he actually visited the creative crew of the show 24 to request that they make episodes where torture backfired. Now, and this was reported in the New Yorker, some of you may remember this, by Jane Mayer. In a Life is Stranger Than Fiction moment, the general came in his uniform, and everyone there thought he was someone for the set, that he wasn't really wearing his uniform, he was an actor. Human Rights First, which is a human rights group, was also so concerned about this that they teamed up with some Hollywood writers and producers and military educators to create a training video specifically for West Point cadets to teach them that they should not replicate what they see on TV and in the movies when they get deployed. They need to separate what's real from what's not. In 2009, Leon Panetta went to his confirmation hearing to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he was asked by the Senate Intelligence Committee about a ticking time bomb scenario and what he would do if he were ever confronted with such a ticking time bomb scenario. Ticking time bomb scenarios are the ultimate Hollywood creation. They are not realistic. The Israelis say they're not realistic, American intelligence officials say they're not realistic, and yet here is the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence at a confirmation hearing of the CIA director nominee asking about ticking time bomb scenarios. And the nominee took the hypothetical seriously and said he would seek whatever additional authority he would need to get information that would protect Americans from imminent harm. The policy was quickly dubbed the Jack Bauer exception. Justice Antonin Scalia, this is not a Democrat or Republican thing. This is affecting policymakers and key officials on both sides of the aisle. Justice Scalia has suggested twice in public that he would turn to Jack Bauer to resolve legal questions about interrogation methods. More recently, we have an even greater blurring of the lines between fact and fiction. There was a movie that came out last year called Act of Valor. Some of you may have seen it. It used real Navy SEALs with their real Navy SEAL tactics in a totally fictionalized plotline. There was a TV show that was launched and canceled last year called Stars Earn Stripes. It was dubbed as a Survivor-like reality show hosted by former four-star General Wesley Clark, where sort of has-been celebrities went through combat training to see who would actually emerge victorious. And then there's the movie Zero Dark 30. Now, I could talk for a long time about Zero Dark 30, but I'll give you just a little bit, and we can save some more for Q&A. The opening frame of that film is unambiguous in its pretense to journalism. Here's what the opening frame of the film reads. Based on first-hand accounts of actual events, right? This isn't inspired by real events. Based on first-hand accounts of actual events. The director and writer of the film, Catherine Bigelow and Mark Bowl, went on a media blitz where they talked about it as a first draft of history and as a reported film, their terms, not mine. The film is portrayed as a documentary-like account of the hunt for bin Laden, and it is nowhere close to the truth, based on the best information there is from what's been unclassified from the intelligence record. Not in terms of the rescue operation, in terms of the role of specific intelligence techniques and the hunt for bin Laden. Let me be more specific. The film makes two key and factually incorrect assertions. The first assertion is that the nom de guerre, the sort of pseudonym of the bin Laden courier, was the key break that led to bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad. Okay? It was the nom de guerre of the courier that was the key piece of intelligence that led to bin Laden. The second key assertion of this film is that that nom de guerre came from a CIA detainee who opened up only after being softened up by torture, right? No government official with access to the classified record has corroborated those two claims. and plenty with access to the classified record have flatly contradicted them, including former CIA Director Leon Panetta, former acting CIA Director Michael Morrell, and the current chairwoman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Dianne Feinstein. And if you want to read today's Washington Post, you can see buried toward the end of the story a little tidbit that bears on this question, because the story is about NSA and NSA's involvement in a drone strike of one of the guys who gave up the name of the bin Laden courier. And at the end of the article, it notes again that Senator Feinstein, talking on the basis of a 6,000-page voluminous classified report about the use of interrogation techniques, Senator Feinstein said that this particular person who was killed by a lethal drone strike gave up the name of the courier, the nom de guerre, before these interrogation techniques were used on him. That's a big difference, before or after. Right? So that's 0 dark 30. Now we come to Ed Snowden. The question is, are there media effects beyond just public support for torture? And the answer is maybe. It's too soon to tell. Again, as I mentioned, I just fielded this poll and we're still doing the statistical analyses, but I thought I'd share some of the hot off the presses findings that we have so far. And I've listed them here and I'll give you some numbers behind them. I found 3 things. The first is that, again, looking at frequent Spytainment watchers, looking at movies and TV versus infrequent watchers, a statistically significant difference between the Spytainment watchers and others in terms of approval for the NSA phone and internet record collection program. Those who watch Spytainment are more likely to approve of these activities from the NSA. Spytainment watchers are more likely to believe that the NSA is telling the truth. They're also more likely to hold a favorable view of the NSA in pretty significant numbers. To give you some idea, people who say they watch spy TV frequently or occasionally, 43% of frequent watchers approve of the phone and internet record collection programs that have been revealed. 29% of infrequent watchers approve. Right? So that's a pretty significant gap of 14 points. In terms of believing the National Security Agency is telling the truth, by the way, more than half of all Americans think the NSA is not telling them the truth. But frequent watchers think the NSA is telling them the truth more than infrequent watchers. Right? So this is the beginning of an interesting, to me in any case, research program to look at what is the influence of entertainment both on what we know about these agencies and what we think about these agencies. The NSA is in the midst of the worst controversy in its organization's history. This is a time when public trust and accountability are essential for developing intelligence policies in a democratic society. And so understanding better the connection between fact and fiction in influencing public attitudes and policymaker beliefs and proclivities and policy proposals is going to be, I think, even more important in the future than it's been in the past. So as they say in the entertainment business, you'll just have to stay tuned. Let me stop there and open it up for questions. Yeah, in the back.
Does torture work?
It's a good question. So the answer is it's a big debate. I think, in my view, the evidence suggests that it doesn't, and I'll tell you why. So a board called the Intelligence Science Board, a nonpartisan expert board, looked into this question in the early 2000s. The closest that they could come to a social science experiment that would approximate the use of torture. I thought about, by the way, could I actually do this on undergraduates at Stanford, see whether torture? IRB approval would not work. This board, but there is research on prolonged sleep deprivation, right? And so what they found was, if you actually look at prolonged sleep deprivation, people are not just less willing to give information, they're not able to give accurate information. And those of us who have ever gone for several nights without sleep understand this is intuitively true. Now, there's a reasonable debate in the intelligence community about what constitutes torture, right? So right now, we're confined to the Army Field Manual for interrogation techniques. Why the Army Field Manual? Because the Army Field Manual happened to be around. It's been around for a long time, and so confining techniques to the Army Field Manual seemed like a good focal point to use for what techniques were acceptable, right? Is it torture if I ask you to lose sleep for a day, or 2 days, or 3 days? Is it torture if I threaten to kill a family member of yours, even if I don't actually do it? These are grayer areas, which I readily concede there's a vigorous debate about inside the intelligence community. But what I've seen, at least based on the social science research on sleep deprivation, and what we know, and there's a lot we don't know, from the classified record that's come to light, is that it was not efficacious in critical intelligence programs that led to things like the hunt for bin Laden. Right? But we'll know more as time goes on and as more becomes publicly available. Yes?
And did you look at age as a factor, and were there generational differences?
Great question. We haven't looked at that yet. It's one of the things that we're looking at. We also want to look at party ID. Is this really just Spytainment viewing habits a proxy for political ideology? Don't know that yet either. Right? So lots more questions that have come up as a result of just we've gotten the top line analysis, and now that's one of the other questions we're going to look into. Gender also. What's the breakdown by gender? We haven't looked at that yet either. Yeah? Yeah.
Another one that occurred to me is the polling in 05 and 07. It's a very different world with the way we did polling. We have YouGov, which is an internet-based polling, versus the old phone-based, I suppose. And I wondered if you've looked at any bias related to the way it's done.
I did ask YouGov about that because sure, the question was that YouGov actually does internet-based polling versus telephone-based polling. It's a really good question about the methodology could be skewing your results. It's also, results can be skewed whether you use polling based on landlines versus cell phones, right? So those kinds of things matter. And my understanding is they've gone to great lengths to ensure that they have a representative sample that would be equivalent to a national telephone poll. And so it's not just that they take any 1,000 people on the internet, but that it's actually demographically carefully vetted to be a representative sample. So it wouldn't be, so my results are not an artifact of bad methodology. That what I'm really getting at is people's attitudes and not just a polling methodology. Yeah. Yes? That's a great question. Let me take the NSA since it's so current in the news. And let me just say, when I went to NSA, I was really struck by a couple things. I was struck by how much in crisis this organization is. Not to make excuses for it, but it is, these are real people, and they're really trying to figure out a way forward. And as they put it, they've been putting out fires since June, and as I told them, and the arsonist is still out there lighting matches, right? They do not know still what damage is left to be done by the revelations of Ed Snowden. What I learned from them is that they know that he compromised 125 documents. They think that he had access and took and made available to the media 50,000 documents. And they think that the tranche of all materials that he took is larger than that. And they think that there are more serious revelations to follow. So this is going to be an ongoing debate. Now, how do we think about it? I think the NSA has gone about it the wrong way. The NSA relies on very narrow legal reasoning to justify the legality of its programs. Legal reasoning that normal people think sounds pretty fishy. And so what has struck me is that while in a narrowly legal sense, the evidence so far suggests that the NSA is within the law, The agency is not asking two more important questions. Is it efficacious, what we're doing? And is it wise, what we're doing? Just because it's legal doesn't mean we should do it. And how do we think about the cost-benefit trade-offs of these programs and whether Americans would support them? That's the debate, I think, that needs to happen. And I'm struck also, the second thing I'm struck by, the last book I wrote a couple years ago is about congressional intelligence oversight. We have a regulatory framework for NSA phone and internet surveillance, and it's a pretty significant regulatory framework. The problem is the American people don't trust it. What do you do when we don't trust the framework? The rest of Congress doesn't trust the intelligence committees right now. If you've been watching this debate, the intelligence committees, by the way, Democrats and Republicans, are defending the NSA. But the rest of Congress, the leadership, again across the aisle, doesn't buy what the intelligence committees are saying, right? And why would that be? Part of it is there's a bit of a we're shocked to find gambling going on here, right? So guess what? The NSA is a spy agency. They're supposed to steal information. Yes, they're supposed to spy on Brazil. I'm sorry, Brazil. They're supposed to spy on you, right? Yes, they're supposed to try to break into things and get information. The question is, what are the limits that we want to put on the agency, particularly with respect to Americans? Members of Congress get very little reward from doing their homework on the very complicated world of intelligence. Remember how I said only 2 members of Congress, the last time I checked, had ever worked in an agency before? This means that they have to learn on the job. Voters don't vote for them based on how they view intelligence. They have to do their homework in classified rooms separate from their offices. They often can't take their staffs. They can't talk about what they do. So imagine you have to go back home to your district and say, I've been very busy in Washington looking into this NSA stuff, but I can't tell you what I found. This is not a winning political strategy for a member who wants to be reelected. So interest groups are very thin and very few in the intelligence world. Voters don't vote for members of Congress based on their stands on these issues. And so there's very low incentive for members of Congress to roll up their sleeves and dig into the incredibly complex and arcane world of NSA's programs. And so they get a lot of political hay when they jump in when something goes wrong, saying, this is terrible, something must be done, when in fact many of them knew beforehand and were able to go to briefings about just what these programs were doing. So that's a long answer. The upshot would be, I think we do need to have a very serious conversation about how we think about efficacy of these programs. How do we think about the wisdom of these programs? And how do we construct a regulatory and oversight framework of these programs that bolsters the very weak oversight framework that we have in the House and Senate Intelligence Committees? Should we have a separate advisory board? Should we bolster the role of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court? How can we create alternative mechanisms, use of the Inspector General, for example, a sort of more robust use of an investigatory arm within the intelligence community, because people aren't buying congressional oversight today, and it's a fundamental problem. Yes, right in the front.
Well, I'm not a paid plant here, but your lecture has been fantastic because Lieutenant
Thank you.
Alexander just announced his early retirement this morning. And
I'll repeat it.
the director of the National Security Agency just announced this morning he was going to take early retirement. Some of the background emails I've seen is that he was very frustrated by the Snowden debacle, but also he feels it's very important that the intelligence community needs to explain to the American people, what NSA is, what it does, and that because of the fact that there's this cloud over NSA that nobody understands what they're doing, that has a lot to do. So what you're saying about somebody needs to have maybe an NSA outpost in Hollywood to kind of explain to the people who are watching Spytainment, what the NSA does, is exactly, this has become a critical issue. I mean, here you have the director of the agency essentially resigning in part because they feel misunderstood.
The agency absolutely feels misunderstood. I think that's only part of the story. There's some evidence that suggests that even people who know what the NSA is doing don't approve of what the NSA is doing. And so I do think there's an attitude that if only the public really understood us better, they'd support us more. I'm not sure that's actually true.
The concern about, many of us have been in the business, the concern is that there are true patriots that are doing the work right now, but the technology has exploded in such a way that even the concern among some of us is that it could, if you get another, let's say, Nixon with his enemies list, or Lyndon Johnson who used to spy on everybody, that they could be turned into a nefarious purpose.
I think, yes, I think that is a concern that many, oh, sorry, the concern was that, okay. The concern is that even if we believe, and I do believe that there are patriotic, wonderful Americans working at this agency, the concern is that what happens if the leadership changes and you have a nefarious character that wants to take the agency in a different direction, and how do we have safeguards against that? And there are safeguards against that. There are rules within the agency. There are laws that are imposed on the agency. And again, I think the issue is that many people aren't buying those right now. And part of it is that the NSA is tone deaf to how to present itself to the public. As I saw General Alexander, and he's a charismatic, wonderful man, but if you saw him in any of his recent hearings, he comes across as Mr. Spock. Right? So he's very logical, and we need a little bit more Captain Kirk, that he gets us, that he understands the emotion involved, that he's a human that really understands the fears of normal Americans. There is a misinformation or a lack of information component to this. A third of all Americans think the NSA is listening to their phone calls in the phone program. Not true. Let me say that again. Not true. The phone record program does not include content of phone calls. Or as I told some students I was talking to a couple weeks ago, they are not listening to your calls with grandma. You do not need to worry about that. But a lot of people think that they are, because every day there's a new admission about, well, what we were really meaning by this was X, Y, and Z, or responding. The agency has been so secretive for its entire existence that in our group of 10 intelligence experts in the social sciences, only one of us had ever been to the agency before, and that was in 1975. So they have a lot of work to do to inform people what they're doing, and they don't have time to do it because Congress is going to move to change the legal authorities under which they're operating, I think, within the next 12 months. So they are behind the curve, and they're going to have to adjust to a new set of authorities, I think, within the next year. Yeah?
It's sort of interesting because I've had the opposite perspective. I don't think people are particularly concerned. I think that they should be, but my view is that they're not concerned. So do you really think Congress is going to, Congress so far can't pass a budget?
That's true. This is the silver lining in the budget cloud, right? If you're an NSA supporter, is that if we can't even get a budget, NSA is safe for now, right? But what I'm hearing and feeling in the intelligence world is that there's so much heat on them internally. By the way, the Obama administration hanging the agency out to dry. You do not hear statements from the White House, from the president, saying that he believes in what they're doing and that he wants to work to try to craft a more tailored and transparent oversight process. In fact, what you see is the president going to the UN General Assembly and apologizing to Brazil that we're spying on them. And that he did. That Brazilian citizens should have a say in the oversight regime of the National Security Agency. So there is a lot of consternation, I think, quietly inside the intelligence community about the fact that the administration is letting them twist in the wind. And you can understand why. Politically, it's a pretty wise thing for the administration to do, right? So I think that compounds the problem. So despite the fact that maybe there are segments of the public that are not at all focused on this issue, there is a significant segment in the Beltway that's very focused on this issue and is not going to let it go. And it's an interesting coalition of people on the left and the right concerned about civil liberties issues, and concerned about the growth of the intelligence community that want to work together to figure out a new path. And I'm not saying that it's a good or a bad thing. I think it is going to happen. Yes? Oh, sorry. Last question.
About 2 years ago, Dana Priest wrote a long series of articles in the Post about the explosion since 9/11 in the intelligence community, and you talked about the growth for 12 or 17 agencies. Hasn't this made us more vulnerable? We ended up with all these contractors sitting in anonymous buildings in Iowa and Kansas and Bethesda, Maryland, buildings that we don't know what goes on in there, full of people, half of them hired by contractors rather than direct federal employees, and we end up with an Edward Snowden. I mean, have we made ourselves more vulnerable with this explosion of intelligence?
So for those of you who couldn't hear the question, it's have we made ourselves more vulnerable with the dramatic growth in intelligence, particularly of contractors? And this article by Dana Priest in the Washington Post and William Arkin is a fabulous, fabulous investigation called Top Secret America that tracks in great detail the growth, in particular of the contractors in the intelligence business. Yes, it's made us less safe. And in fact, one of the issues that the NSA discussed with us, and I should hasten to add, we said we would go only if it would be unclassified and we could talk about what we were discussing at the NSA. That was a prerequisite for this academic consortium to go to NSA, and they agreed. And they talked about how they're concerned with contractors. First of all, there's less accountability with contractors. And second, there's less sense of sharing the mission. So Ed Snowden wasn't part of us, if you're NSA. He was working for a contractor. He wasn't in the NSA compound. He wasn't in an NSA, right? He's not quite us. Does he get the mission? Does he feel like he has colleagues? Is he part of a community? And the more that you have people farther from the tent pole, the more concerned you have to be about the possibility of an insider threat. The second trend since 9/11, which has generally been a positive trend, is that we moved from an intelligence culture that was need to know, with lots of silos, information silos, where information did not get shared because it was need to know, and I'm not going to tell you my secrets because that's what gives me power, to a culture that is need to share. We have to share information to work across agency lines. And need to share means you push information into computer systems that more people can have access to. And that exacerbates your insider threat risk. So the growth of contractors, the growth of need to share, leads to an increased risk that you're going to get an insider that is sharing classified information that shouldn't be shared. And those are problems we're going to have to contend with for a long time to come. The biggest concern about the backlash of this need to share and the Ed Snowden result is that we'll move the pendulum too far back to the need to know. And need to share is critical for us to be able to get a full perspective to stopping the next attack and other threats that are looming over the horizon. I want to thank you all for being such a good audience and enjoy your reunion.